You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to episode 71 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. You can connect with the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and sign up for the newsletter on our website, socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be all about Russian disinformation in Ukraine, which is an interesting case because while there's been a lot of discussion about Russian interference and disinformation in the United States, this phenomenon goes back much deeper. And in terms of digital tech, we can pinpoint Russian disinformation starting around the time of the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine. Now, if you're not familiar with the Euromaidan protests or you need a bit of a refresher, these were a series of protests in late 2013 and early 2014 that were mostly centered around the Independence Square in Kiev, Ukraine's capital, and they all started when then-President Viktor Yanukovych refused to sign an association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, which would basically provide a framework for closer political and economic cooperation between the two polities. But that's a bit of a sticky subject because public opinion in Ukraine is quite split between being pro-Western and advocating more cooperation with the European Union, and especially in eastern Ukraine being more pro-Russian, obviously Ukraine having a history as a Soviet state. And it's also worth noting that in eastern Ukraine, public opinion behind the protesters was only around 20%. So getting back to the protests, they got increasingly violent with pro-Yanukovych forces shooting protesters shooting back. All of it culminated in February 2014 with the Ukrainian Revolution and the protesters being successful in toppling the Yanukovych regime. Now, this is only the beginning of the story because Yanukovych flees to Russia. Some politicians on the Crimean Peninsula refuse to recognize the interim government as legitimate, which leads to the annexation of Crimea by Russia. This sparks pro-Russian protests in the eastern part of Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass region, where separatists get into a military conflict with pro-Ukrainian forces that still goes on today. So a long chain of events, and we're going to get into exactly the role that social media has played in all of it, with the particular focus on how social media platforms were used as part of a wider Russian-backed influence operation to change public opinion in Ukraine. And this is of particular concern at the moment because Ukraine has presidential elections at the end of March, where one of the key issues on voters' minds and one of the key issues that politicians are campaigning on is how to resolve the conflict in Donbass and what type of relationship should there be with Russia moving forward. So clearly fertile fields for Russian disinformation, and we're going to look at an organization called Stop Fake, which is a network of activists, volunteers, and academics who are working to fact-check and debunk fake news coming out about Ukraine from Russia and putting out weekly YouTube videos that aim to inform the public about the stories that are being disseminated. So that's super interesting, and joining me to talk more about it is Kateryna Kruk. She is an analyst at Stop Fake and a special fellow at the European Values think tank. And what's cool about Kateryna is she has frontline experience from the Euromaidan protests and was one of the first people to start tweeting about the protests and keeping the West informed as to what was going on, which eventually earned her a Freedom Award from the Atlantic Council. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then Kateryna has also worked in communications for the Ukrainian parliament and actually popularized the Twitter feed there. So we talk about the content strategies of communicating policy to citizens as well. So this is a really wide-ranging episode and covers so many interesting topics, from social movements and protests to how to stop disinformation to looking at government communication in the Ukrainian context. So a fascinating interview. Kateryna has a lot of knowledge to share, and without further ado, let me turn it over to her. My guest is Kateryna Kruk. She is an analyst at Stop Fake and a special fellow at the European Values think tank. Kateryna, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So before we launch into this topic of fake news and how to stop it, why don't we start out with a bit of introduction into your professional background and experience working in digital? How did you get involved with social media communication, and what types of areas have you been working in so far?
I would say that this is quite interesting and even revolutionary story because my first experience with working with social media very intensively was actually during the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, which started in November 2013 and in a way ended up in 2014 in February. So just in a month, we will have the 5th anniversary. And my role during this revolutionary movements and events in Ukraine was quite peculiar because I've also a perfectly ordinary protester who was standing for her beliefs, and I still do greatly believe in the values of Euromaidan. But from the first days of the revolution, I've started sending tweets in English describing what is going on Maidan and actually what does it mean and how it feels to be a young girl taking part in the revolution or something that potentially can change her country forever, as we know right now. And it figured out to be a very interesting and very needed information for the foreign audience because once again, I was mostly working with English and there was a great deal of shortage of information coming from Ukraine, from the ground, from the protesters. Obviously, there were some informations and articles written by journalists. There were positions of politicians and authorities of Ukraine. But I think there was a clear void and clear lack of information from Ukrainians. What is the motivation of people standing there? And throughout the frosty days of winter 2013-2014, I started working with world-class media organizations like CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, France 24, and so on and so on, many leading newspapers and TV channels in many European and world countries, in both Americas as well. And in a way, it brought me to this digital world, first of all, as an activist, not only as a user. And I remember that in those days of Euromaidan, I started gaining this practical experience of how the modern information campaign or disinformation campaigns work, because I was observing the very few and the very first disinformation campaigns enrolling while Euromaidan was still going on. And the first attacks of trolls and bots, at that time, I didn't even know the names, and I didn't know that this is actually something staged and planned against me. So my experience both in this combat and disinformation field, but also in the digital world is very much practical. It's everything coming mostly from the barricades, what one could even say. And later I was using this experience also when I was doing some short projects for Ukrainian government. I was having an experience of being director of communications or like leading some projects based on the communications of certain reforms which were undertaken by the Ukrainian government, and also for the Ukrainian parliament, where for a certain time during the partnership between Ukrainian parliament and NGO center called Ukraine Crisis Media Center, I was also doing the international communications and social media for Ukrainian parliament.
That's awesome. And I want to ask you about those different facets of communication as an activist, inside, outside government, et cetera. But I want to kind of hone in on the Euromaidan protests. And I mean, you've had some real frontline experience there looking at this disinformation kind of as it was coming out. And as I understand it, the IRA, this sort of Russian troll farm, was formed around 2013 or so. Mm-hmm. Would you say that that was sort of the start of these Russian disinformation campaigns online around the Euromaidan protests?
Absolutely, absolutely. And from my personal experience, they didn't even start with the very first days of Euromaidan. I do believe that also Russians, they were looking at what is going on in Ukraine and trying kind of understand what is the nature of the protest and what can be their own benefit, or rather which sides to take when it comes to Euromaidan. Mm-hmm. First disinformation campaigns, when I've understood there is something wrong going on, they started with the beginning of December and mid-December. So it was mostly 2 or 3 weeks ever since Maidan has started. And I remember that I started noticing increased activity in my timeline, but increased activity, first of all, when it comes to negative comments and negative retweeting, or, for example, people who started writing some very sarcastic, negative, or even abusive things when it comes to me. It wasn't the case before. There were a lot of reactions that were coming from abroad, but mostly people were very friendly. They were very much interested about what is going on. And suddenly, like, boom, you go to your Twitter feed and you see that there are like hundreds of notifications, people writing all the different sorts of stuff. And this is the thing, that the reactions were very much different from what was before, and they were coming in great numbers. This is the first thing, like the first characteristic that allows you to understand that there is an attack, a planned attack going on, when you have this sudden increase in numbers and in general mood of the reactions. And I think that the full-scale disinformation campaign about Maidan definitely started with the beginning of 2014, with the moment when also the development of the revolution itself was undergoing. And from merely peaceful protests, we actually turn out having clashes with riot police. And a few days ago, we're actually celebrating the 5th anniversary of so-called Fire Christening, when protesters started having open clashes with riot police, and first people were shot on the Maidan. And at that moment, great deal of fake information was spread about the nature of Maidan, about its proposed violence, about the participation of far-right or other radical forces. And it was really very easy to see for someone who was standing on the ground that it's simply not true. And the speed with which information was shared was also raising a lot of questions whether there is a certain algorithm or there is a certain network behind it, because it was too suspicious that something like that, those numbers can come in natural forces.
Mm-hmm. And was it mostly on Twitter? Because that was where a lot of activists like yourself were communicating in English to an outer audience, or was it on Facebook, VKontakte? Like which platforms was the disinformation happening during Maidan?
So first interesting thing that I do believe is very much worth sharing with your listeners is that Euromaidan has actually very much influenced the social media usage and preferences of Ukrainians. This was the first moment ever when preferences of Ukrainians started westernizing a bit. Because during Euromaidan, both Facebook and Twitter, they got incredible boost of new followers, new people who subscribed to those networks and started using this. Before that, unconditional number one was Kontakte. And actually, the very nature of this platform, of this network, started causing a lot of problems for users. During Euromaidan, we started getting information and confirmation, actually, that the private data and profiles of the active participants of Maidan, but mostly people who were, for example, administrating the pages or like groups about Euromaidan, like helping Euromaidan, bringing food, bringing medical stuff, and so on and so forth, they started being targeted by trolls, by bots. And another thing which became very problematic during Maidan is that Russian authorities requested it, and sometimes they were successful in closing the groups which were bringing together a lot of people and which were in a way coordinating different segments of Euromaidan, and suddenly they were ceasing to exist. Another interesting thing about Maidan, why it is so important, because Euromaidan is one of those examples of revolutions of modern type, when, unlike the old type of revolutions, when you have one clear leader, one clear center of organization, the leadership of Maidan was rather horizontal and shared. So, for example, the social networks, they were enabling this horizontal leadership to happen, because suddenly people could gather around certain idea or certain sphere of interest which was interesting to them and coordinate themselves. So there wasn't one organization or like headquarters which was taking the lead in every single aspect. Like, for example, there was one group for owners of the cars who were writing that I'm going from this and this district in Kyiv, and I will be going towards Maidan. If someone would like to have a lift, would like to go with me to Maidan, here I am. I will be waiting for you in that part of the district. So like this carpooling. So even before Uber was introduced in Ukraine, we had this, in a way, society brought mechanism how to help each other. Then there was another group which was for medical staff, for doctors and medical students and practitioners who were, for example, organizing the ships, who is helping Maidan in which time and which day. And those were groups of interest, but each of them, they were coordinating the certain field of activities on Maidan. That is why social media was so crucially important during Maidan, because they were not only the instruments of sharing information about what is going on the ground, but they were helping to make this revolution alive and functioning. And when we've noticed that Kontakte is acting very aggressively towards those groups, people started shifting towards Facebook and Twitter. So Facebook at some point became also the driving force for Maidan, mostly because it was a platform where people could organize themselves.
It's super interesting you bring up the horizontal networks. In academia, at least, it goes very well with this theory of connective action by Bennett and Segerberg, yes. Which is strengthening these horizontal networks and sort of not needing a strict hierarchical structure to enact protests. So I want to keep on that point of horizontal networks and talk a bit about Stop Fake, which is this organization that is out to fact check and sort of create awareness and basically take down fake news from Russia. So can you tell us a bit about that organization in terms of like what are its missions, its methods, and activities that it's working with?
So it's really very natural to go from Maidan to Stop Fake and its story, because thanks to all the different things that started happening in information space of Ukraine and also abroad during Euromaidan, many professionals, mostly journalists back then, 5 years ago, you didn't have the expert on disinformation and communication. Those are rather new terms for, at least for this part of the world, for Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And the community of journalists in Kyiv Mohyla University, in School of Journalism, Kyiv Mohyla University is one of the leading academic institutions in Ukraine, which was also very much active not only as academia as such and forward thinking, but also as a community of professors and students. And they came up with this idea that indeed we have such a great deal of fake news which are being shared. And it's really very important to remember that those first campaigns, they started during Maidan. And I think they were, the certain mechanisms and methods, they were tested. But the beginning of the annexation of Crimea and the information element of this annexation is simply incredible. This is really, if certain person is really very much critical about the power of internet and social media might have and would think, but what kind of impact those fake news might have, one should look at the experience of Crimean takeover operation and the role that information was playing during this operation. That is why it became very clear for those practitioners in Kyiv and all around Ukraine that we should do something about it. And it was really very natural and first-hand reaction that if you have fake information, you have to debunk it. You have to prove that this is wrong, because obviously it's not enough to say that, look, this is fake, don't believe it, this is disinformation. If you don't provide the real proof, if you don't debunk the story, it's just, you are throwing words. You aren't being credible. And actually, in March this year, Stop Fake will celebrate the 5th anniversary. We are one of the oldest world organizations which started leading with fact-checking, with producing different methodology for that. So the aim and the grand mission of Stop Fake is obviously to make people more aware, to give them instruments and tools, but also to give them proofs so people can understand when they have been faked, when they have been attacked informationally. And obviously, so they could know the real story behind the certain headline.
I want to ask a bit about the methodologies that you're using, but first I want to kind of pinpoint on that Crimea example, because we've been talking about Maidan, and then I think the next sort of, as you're saying, that might have been a testing ground for these influence operations. And then I guess you're alluding to the fact that Crimea was a more professional operation, or that had more impact in terms of fake news. Can you give us some examples from that?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, when it is coming to Crimea, it is really very much important to understand and to view this information element as a part of the military takeover operation. There is a bit of the conflict, or maybe rather the different perception when it comes to information element of modern operations and this hybrid warfare that certain people say exists and certain people say that it doesn't. Well, Crimea is an example showing that, at least for Russia, at least in the understanding of Russians and in the understanding of their military doctrine, information element and information operations, they are part of the big scale operations which can include kinetic element but also information element. Why Crimea is a perfect example to that. The fakes that were disseminated during Maidan, or rather the perception of the Maidan which was created while it was still lasting, was really very much negative. So it was really very much about this national element. Russian propaganda and also the authorities in Ukraine and big TV stations, they were trying to portray and present Maidan as, the gathering of some radicals, of people who are just destroying the peace in the country and the buildings in the city center, which are run by fascists and nationalists who are very much against, Russia as such, against Russian language and so on and so forth. And those two elements, which mostly are quite peculiar for the region in which we are living in Eastern Europe, mainly the attitude towards nationalism and nationalistic groups, and the attitude towards Russian language and whether people are free to use it or not. Those were the main narratives that actually were used during the takeover operation. So how Russians were operating in a way. First, apparently, to the best of our knowledge, they had prepared a very good background analysis of the different preferences and views of the citizens of Crimea, of people who were living in the peninsula. Based on that, they were able to inject certain fake narratives which were playing along already existing sentiments. And two main narratives that were used were actually about the Russian language, that Crimea is predominantly Russian-speaking region, with many people who have Russian heritage. The narrative was going that, there are trains with Ukrainian nationalists which are going to Crimea, and they will kill and punish and beat people who are speaking Russian. So immediately they were creating this sense of insecurity, which was coming from the rest of Ukraine. Secondly, Maidan, and in a way the victory of the pro-Maidan forces with the escape of former President Yanukovych and his allies, was portrayed as coup d'etat. So it was portrayed as an absolutely destabilizing element for the rest of Ukraine, and they were creating the sense that country is collapsing. That is why at the moment when those green men, Russian military officers and soldiers, started appearing on the streets of Crimea, many people locally have envisioned them as some kind of saviors, people who are able to bring stability, who are able to bring order, and first and foremost protect citizens of Crimea from those aggressive nationalist Ukrainians who are coming to rape their wives and beat their children. Another element which is also very important is that, for example, TV towers and the TV centers that were accepting the signal in certain cities, when, for example, those TV stations were taken over by Russian military, Russians were immediately changing the signal. So, for example, it was impossible any longer to have Ukrainian TV channels in your TV at home. You were either having the local ones or immediately the Russian ones. So, they were cutting people from the different sources of information that would dilute the perception which was created by the propaganda.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly complex. And I'm sure that back at the time, because there wasn't so much awareness around disinformation, that these stories coming through the television or through people's VKontakte or Facebook feeds were probably more believable because we hadn't seen such a phenomenon before.
Yes. And another thing, which I also personally understand only with the time, going back in what was going on in Ukraine 5 years ago. First and foremost, what disinformation and fake news are doing is that they are greatly polluting the information space of any country or any given city. What is meant by the pollution? It's not only the quality of the news, but also the quantity of them. So suddenly you are bombarded by such a great amount of different news that at certain point you're simply getting lost. And this is the problem when you don't know what can you trust and what should be distrusted by yourself. But another thing is that when you have such a great amount of fake news and manipulative news, it is incredibly hard for quality news, for truth, to break through them. So in a way, you have this kind of information fog which is surrounding you, and users simply aren't breaking through because you have all the fakes, all the manipulations which are being shared, and people are resharing them and only intensifying the very fog which is surrounding you. Why I said that even on personal example, it's really very easy to see. Only with time being, we, for example, start getting certain details, or we started having the clear picture of what was going on in Crimea in those days. With days when the takeover operation was still ongoing, it wasn't very clear, even in Kyiv, to understand, but what is going on in Crimea? So what does it even mean there are Russian green men, or like the takeover of some military bases? Is there any kind of protest mood from people locally, and so on and so forth? And only after several years, when the mist of disinformation has come down a little bit, we start getting facts. And it appears that even in Ukraine, even in the country which was really very close to the source of information, like to the source of events, in the rest of the country, we didn't understand what is going on in Crimea.
And was there any sort of warning of the tech companies or social media platforms themselves? We've heard about, for example, the genocide in Myanmar, that there was contact with the platforms beforehand. Were the platforms alerted about this spread of disinformation in Maidan or Crimea?
At the moment when it was taking place, to the best of my knowledge, no. First of all, also because for people who were in the center of events here in Ukraine, we also didn't understand the nature of the events that much. The events were unfolding with incredible speed, and you just have to remember that it was something very new, and the scale of the events, and obviously the scale of disinformation and networks which were operating them, they were still very much unknown to us. So in a way, we were observing the phenomena, but we didn't have probably time back then to understand the nature of it, and obviously to alert other tech giants or tech companies of what was going on. Those steps were taken a bit later. I would rather say mostly in summer of 2014, where we were already after Maidan and we were already after Crimea takeover operation and in the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine. And for example, we started observing the thing that didn't happen before in Ukraine. The opinion makers, leaders of opinion, thought, and many prominent Ukrainians, both from authorities but also civil activists, or for example, Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting in eastern Ukraine, and they were given first-hand information about what is going on and actually about Russian involvement. Suddenly we have started seeing a wave of them being banned on Facebook. And this is something that never ever happened in Ukraine on such a scale, when suddenly people who are leaders of thought and reliable sources of first-hand information, they simply disappear from information field. And only at that moment, actually, we started contacting Facebook back then. Our plea wasn't heard. Now Facebook, there is a certain feeling that is trying to improve a little bit the security surroundings for Ukrainian users, and they are trying to make certain steps before Ukrainian elections. But back then in 2014, when we started asking actually tech giants, well, first and foremost Facebook, our recommendations and our concerns, they weren't heard.
Mm. And I mean, now with a bit of hindsight, as you mentioned, I think one of the things that this whole disinformation phenomenon has shown is that these platforms do need some help in terms of verifying information and fact checking. So, and I think that's exactly what Stop Fake is doing. So can you walk us through the process of how you would actually identify a fake news story kind of from start to finish?
Yes. So starting from the very beginning in 2014, when we were still a rather young organization, and the network, I wouldn't say was that big. It was mostly relying on Kyiv Mohyla School of Journalism and students and professors over there. And obviously the workflow was just incredible those days, because those were people who simply sacrificed several months of their lives to monitoring what is going on online. So every single news was checked by the living person, someone who was going through all the details and so on and so forth. And this is how we actually were able to build the first credibility and, the first stage for the recognition of the project. Later, it became a bit easier, because with more people getting to know about Facebook and obviously having more and more credibility and position within the field, now, for example, we have a lot of ordinary users of internet who are simply sending some stories to us and asking to fact check them. But still, we're really very much relying on our own network of fact checkers. We have, if I'm not mistaken, 12 or 13 different language versions, which have some content which is being translated to all the languages. This is something very important. But it is really very interesting to see that there is quite a great deal of unique content on every single language version. So we have networks which are, for example, working in Italy, in Bulgaria, in Poland, in Germany, in France. And they are monitoring their own domestic field when it comes to the disinformation, when it comes to fakes. So if there is a news which is being flagged, for example, to us, someone sent it and asked for a proof, or we find information which really sounds as a fake, or we know that this website is mostly sharing fake news, fake stories, and suddenly certain news started being, redistributed and disseminated throughout the network, then our fact checker reads the news. If it's needed, contacts people if they are mentioned in the article, looks for the first source of the information, first-hand information, reads all the documents if it's needed, and doing, the entire process of fact checking. So checking, first of all, the source, then whether this news or situation which is being described has ever happened. If there are any people involved, we are always contacting them. We're always trying to get their first-hand interview and information from the person mentioned in the story. Then if there are any documents or events or conferences mentioned, we also check them. So if we're unconfident or we have any kind of hesitation that the story might be fake, we are checking all the different elements about the story. So who, when, why, and what is being written.
And then let's say a story is deemed to be fake. Do you report it to the platform? Or I know you have your own distribution channel as well, where you sort of have these YouTube videos that cover the sort of fake news of the week, stuff like that. So what actually do you do when you find these fake news stories?
It really much depends on which sources has actually shared this information. Obviously, if the fake news story was shared by, Telekanal Zvezda, which is owned by Russian Ministry of Defense, obviously it doesn't make great sense to reach out to them to say, hey, you are sharing fake news.
Right.
But sometimes we have seen this experience with leading Ukrainian media outlets who by mistake have redistributed some fake news. And they are reacting to our information when we're saying, look, we saw that you have shared this news, but here's our debunking information, our debunking story. and you have done something bad, and they are reacting to that, first of all, because of the credibility and because of the reputation of Stop Fake. But when it comes to disseminating our products, what we have is first and foremost the database of our debunked fakes. And this is really very important. Like today, this morning, I was talking to Ukrainian activist also who is working in the field of disinformation, who is launching the app and also plugin, which will in a way be checking your news feeds and will immediately flag you if, for example, the story is fake, or you have shared a fake story, of any of your friends have shared the fake story, or for example, the story is not fake, it might be manipulation, but the website from which it was shared is definitely unreliable. And this work is actually focusing on the database which was collected so far by Stop Fake, obviously, but also other fact-checking organizations around the world. So it's really very important to have this database because in a way, other organizations, they can build on that experience and use it for their further projects. So this is the first source will be the website, which has updates and different language versions. Then we have social media, where we share the most important pieces. We also have radio program here in Ukraine. We are doing 3 different language versions of video digests. English one and Russian one, they are being done solely for social media in Ukraine. And we also have Ukrainian version, which is being shared by the network of Ukrainian public broadcaster and also on our social media. And we're also having a newspaper, which is being precisely prepared and disseminated in the regions close to the occupied territories in Ukraine. So close to the Crimean border and close to the front line, so-called gray zone in eastern Ukraine, to people who are very much targeted by the disinformation, not only from central channels and so on and so forth, but many, many local ones. Those who are becoming real targets and real victims. And we are reaching out to them with a newspaper which is being disseminated to their homes.
Super interesting. And as you were kind of saying before, I think you have to kind of look back, I'm sure, at this database to get a sense, to start stitching together what are the narratives and strategies that these actors are using in spreading disinformation. And what I think is interesting is on the Stop Fake website, you have a Stop Fake bingo card that outlines some of the key strategies used for spreading fake news. So what are some of those main strategies that you are seeing being used to spread disinformation?
We even have a Stop Fake game, a board game. So you can feel yourself, first of all, either as a fact checker and you have to guess whether it's a fake news and what you're going to do with that, but also as a fake maker for you to see the other side of the medal and how it feels. So it's this element of gamification can sometimes be really very, very interesting, give you another flavor of the entire issue. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the main grand narratives of Russian disinformation against Ukraine, so the biggest ones obviously would be those which are covering the crimes that Russia committed against Ukraine. Russians have invested incredible amount of time and efforts to make people believe that there was no Crimea takeover operation. It wasn't the military operation conducted by Russian state and by Russian army, but that this was the rightful willingness of the people living in Crimea and the referendum and so on and so forth. So I still think that in the entire narrative building, Crimea remains one of the weakest points of Russia, because later on, with years passing, they were the ones confirming that, actually we are giving medals to people who were taking part in that operation. And yes, those are noble soldiers who actually brought Crimea back to the mother Russia. Then the next big pile of the disinformation and fake stories is actually Donbas. And in this regard, Russia is trying to make people believe that this is civil war. There is no Russian involvement, that, those are just local Ukrainian people in Donbas who so much disagree with the central authorities in Kyiv and so on and so forth. And there is no international involvement. And obviously, Russia is not responsible for all the crimes. Because I have to remind that so far, it's almost the 5th year of the beginning of the conflict. And in war in eastern Ukraine, we have lost more than 10,000 people killed, and we have almost 2 million people internally displaced within Ukraine. So those people who were forced to leave Donbas because of the military action. So the costs of war are incredibly high. Another very interesting, I would say the first ever example of the global disinformation campaign is MH17. And in this regard, this is something, this is the topic where Russia is targeting both Ukraine and also international audience, because Russia is targeting Ukraine, trying to prove that there was no Russian involvement and it was Ukrainian airplanes who shot the MH17 and so on and so forth. But it is really very interesting to follow how Russians were unfolding the entire network of disseminating information about MH17, because it requires a great number of different language versions. I think so far, globally, this is the most elaborate and the biggest network of fake news sharing about a particular subject. So like all the different flavors of propaganda and all the different types, how Russians actually trying to change their perception of this event can be seen from the MH17 example. And the last grand topic, let's say so, for disinformation is actually targeting, first of all, Ukrainian political and economical situation. So first of all, starting with narratives that Ukraine is a failed state, that we are doing very badly economically, that Maidan was a coup d'etat, which was organized by European Union and the US, that Ukrainians are just marionettes of the West. And obviously, all the different fake news targeting the domestic issues in Ukraine, making people believe that we're a very shaken country, that we are doing very badly, and we are on the edge of internal dissolution.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially with this MH17 flight controversy as a global example, because I wanted to ask you, I mean, Ukraine is obviously one of the key targets for Russian disinformation and propaganda.
Yes.
And all the examples that you mentioned are very specifically focused on the Ukrainian situation or the conflict in Crimea or Donbass. Do you think that the strategies, so you mentioned the bots and the troll armies, I mean, is that the same type of manipulation techniques that are being used in various elections around the globe? Or do you think there's something special about the Ukrainian region in terms of this disinformation?
Both yes and yes, because I do believe that Ukraine was one of the biggest testing grounds when it comes to Russian disinformation techniques. And indeed, when you follow through all the different types of disinformation or manipulations, or how information is being disseminated, because it's really very important to remember that this problem is with disinformation. It's not only fake news, it's not only fake stories or fake photos or memes which are being shared online. It's also about the network of friendly TV stations and radio stations, newspapers, the network of so-called experts who are sharing who are introducing several topics to the public debate, which are very, very much favored by the Kremlin. This is the network of different conferences and position papers and analytical works, and obviously financing of politicians and different political groups. All of this we have seen in Ukraine and still seen in Ukraine, and obviously different elements can be seen in other countries as well, with Marine Le Pen and Russians financing her campaign and her party being one of the brightest examples in Europe when it comes to this type of efforts, with Brexit referendum or Catalonia referendum, showing the examples how bots and actually trolls, they help create in a certain mood in the society, which is playing in the hand of certain politicians or political groups. So sometimes, and this is also an interesting example which was analyzed during the Italian elections last year, parliamentary ones, when all the different, so like the main narrative builder was Sputnik Italy, unfortunately. And they didn't share almost no news about a certain political party or a certain political leader. But they were sharing a lot of news on the topics which were favored by those political parties. Mostly I'm talking about far-right and right organizations in Italy and the anti-migration topic. So in a way, the great deal, I mean, almost, I don't want to fool you on the data, but if I'm not mistaken, not less than 1,300,000 different tweets and different articles, they were disseminated throughout the networks in Italy, which were basically only about migrants and having this anti-migrant flavor and creating this impression that, we are a target and our country is a target and we have to do something. So they simply helped creating the mood, which was later very operational and very natural for the far-right organizations, which, as we know, done very, very well in the Italian elections. So I would say that the methodology, or rather, the playbook is pretty much the same, the algorithm, in a way, of the disinformation campaign. But what is different in every single country is their own domestic situation, their own domestic problems. Russians are really very smart because they don't have a unique playbook that they use internationally. They take a very good look at the domestic situation about what is going on, and they're in a way always using the cracks or like the hot topic debates or problems which already exist in the society. So in a way, it would be very much false and deceptive to say that Kremlin is responsible for all the different kinds of problems which exist in Western societies. No, but they definitely abusing them, and they are making all those cracks even more visible.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's also something that you said before with the Maidan protests, that the Russians had sort of mapped the sentiment around different positions and were playing on those cleavages. And I think that's the same. So it's not that they're targeting immigration just because it's immigration, but because that is the actual rift in society at the moment. And then they serve to sort of divide those rifts.
Absolutely.
Interesting. A few more questions for you. I wanted to ask about social media messaging apps like WhatsApp and Telegram, because those were quite a bit in focus around disinformation in the Brazilian elections last year. How do you deal with these sort of encrypted apps that are very difficult to tap into?
Well, both when it comes to Ukraine, and also think this is rather a general trend, to the best of my knowledge, of the organizations in Europe which are dealing with different aspects of disinformation and its dissemination. This is the next level. This is, I think, this will become a trend on what can be done with those platforms, and also we shouldn't forget about YouTube, which is incredibly popular, I think, all around the world, and we still don't know how. I mean, we know that this platform is really very vulnerable to the disinformation, but still there are no good methods how to tackle it. But back when it comes to WhatsApp and Telegram, I think this is one of the shortcomings of the analysts and people who are working in this field so far, because obviously our main target and the biggest networks with which we are working are Facebook and Twitter. Twitter isn't that big still in Ukraine, but according to the fresh data, Facebook has an audience of 15 million Ukrainians. So this is really very, very big. With WhatsApp, it's also not that much popular in Ukraine, but we have indeed this great problem with Telegram. And the problem that no one actually is taking a look about what is going on there, and this is a platform which is becoming increasingly popular. With encrypted types of platforms, the peculiarity of the situation is that it's almost impossible to crack it from the outside and saying like, oh, we have cracked your code just because we're analysts and we're trying to see whether your platform is secure or not. It really very much requires working with the platform. And obviously the first step which arises from that, platform understanding that they are being misused and they actually become the platform that helps spreading disinformation. I don't know about any European efforts actually to work with WhatsApp so closely, but recently I've had a chance to learn about Indian experience where WhatsApp is incredibly popular. And peculiar, very, very interesting characteristic feature of Indian background and Indian situation that the number of people who are using social media and who are using smartphones is several times higher than the level of literacy in the country. Meaning that people so much rely on the source of information and what is being shared, and the even instruments of how the information being shared, like audio messages or video messages, in case of WhatsApp and Telegram, that sometimes it can even lead to some deadly cases. And judging from Indian experience, there is always this learning curve of a certain organization, and there are always problems with that. The story repeats exactly as we had with Facebook. So the first stage was denial. So both Facebook and Facebook and Twitter as the first networks to which we turned in a way, they were saying, no, this is just not happening. There is no problem. You just, being paranoid and so on and so forth. And indeed, it looks like certain networks, they need time and they need a great deal of evidence to understand that indeed their platforms are being used for very wrong things. And only when this understanding comes, there is a possibility, there is, the room for maneuvering for civil society organizations, different kind of analysts and so on and so forth, to work with this platform to see how the situation can be improved. But I would say that WhatsApp, Telegram, and also YouTube, those going to be the next stages in fighting disinformation.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask, are you gearing up to deal with this concept of deep fakes, for example? That's kind of seen as the next frontier, these sort of manipulated videos and images.
This is very scary. Like last year during one of the conferences here in Ukraine, I had a chance to meet some practitioners from the UK. First of all, those people who were working on the very mechanism of how, I wouldn't say deep fakes, but the videos that can be so close to perfection that it's really very hard to distinguish whether it's really one or not. So it's one of the examples when the technology which was developed started being abused, and something that was a technological interest or academic interest started being misused by the bad guys. And indeed, apparently, when you think about the different mechanisms, how to avoid it or how to protect ourselves from this, from the moment when it will become a reality, and from the practitioners from that field, it's more or less 1 year when we will have the problem with deep fakes all over us. And the only things how can actually we challenge it is, first of all, working with platforms which will be sharing it. That is why I'm telling that YouTube and other video streaming services should be the focus for many practitioners and many analysts, because this will become a great problem. But also, it will really very much depend on the trust. So we have to have reliable media. We have to have reliable NGOs or any other types of organizations which would have enough credibility and enough capacity to check whether this is a deepfake video or not, in order to alert people. It brings us back to the journalism and the trust which is within the society. Can we trust journalists? Can we trust certain media outlets? Or there is no trust whatsoever? And the very basic thought that brings us to when we think about these deepfakes, that without trust and without organizations which are doing their work very well, and they deliver good results, and without having those platforms that can be trusted by people, we are simply doomed to live in the Hobbesian reality when it's war of everyone against everyone, and we're just lost. We're simply lost.
Well, that's quite a depressive picture, but
it is depressive, to be honest.
In the more short term, you have Ukrainian presidential elections coming up in March. Are you noticing an uptick in activity? Are you expecting an uptick in disinformation activity ahead of those elections?
It is another depressing topic. Thank you for bringing it up. Yes, there are all grounds to believe that Russians will tackle Ukrainian elections. First of all, not only as a mere exercise of how foreign influence can actually be operational during this type of democratic processes taking place, because we've seen that Russians has actually mastered those techniques in many Western cases, in many Western countries. We also understand that Russians have incredible interest in Ukrainian elections when it comes to the person that will lead the country as a president, but also the parliament, because in 2019, unfortunately, we have the full cycle of renewal of Ukrainian authorities. So first presidential elections in the late March, and parliamentary elections in the end of October. Knowing that, there are already certain initiatives which are starting here in Ukraine, but also abroad, to monitor what is going on in the information space in Ukraine, taking into account also cyber aspect. Are there any grounds to believe that there will be any kind of cyber attacks on, let's say, Central Electoral Commission of Ukraine servers, which might be one of the vulnerable moments here. And both fake, we're already doing a certain type of job. So together with Atlantic Council, which has launched this Ukraine election task force, where we're already monitoring the information space, trying to look for the different fake news, but also manipulations coming not only from Russian websites, but also the network of those schemy websites which were created in Ukraine, just merely for sharing fake news.
The ones that are sort of profit-driven.
Yes, exactly. Some of them, they are profit-driven. That is why all the headlines are very clickbait, because it's about having traffic. But there are certain websites and the entire networks which are believed to be orchestrated and run from Russia. And Facebook actually has recently given us a proof that this is actually the case, because they have taken down more than 100 different pages, groups, and private profiles on Facebook, all of which were associated to the Sputnik employees and lead to this internet research agency, which is the fabric of trolls in Olgino, close to St. Petersburg.
Right. Well, I do want to ask you a bit before we end here about your experience in government communication, which I think is a bit more of a positive story. Can you talk about the work that you've been doing in working with the Ukrainian parliament in terms of social media communication?
Yes, with great pleasure, because indeed this is one of those few examples showing that it is possible to make a difference. And unlike the attitude of many Ukrainians that our institutions are just relicts of the past, of the Soviet heritage, sometimes they can open up and become more user-friendly and citizen-friendly. So together with the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which is a network created by the leading professionals in communications and PR, in the eve of the Crimean takeover operation, we were having the project called One Voice Policy. It was about inviting professionals from the private sector to work for the government institutions on short-term projects. I mean, some were short-term projects, some lasted for several years because there was indeed this request within the ministries to work with them communications-wise. So we've understood that one of the initial problems that we have in Ukraine as a society and a country as such is that sometimes we fail to communicate between different groups and elements. So, there is a great deal of work which is being done by the government or by the parliament, but they aren't properly communicating it. That is why people believe that nothing is being done. Or, for example, which is incredibly important when it comes to the reform, is how you can communicate in reform to people. Because in most of the cases, reform foresees some drastic changes. Sometimes it can be painful in the short term. Definitely, this is the change of the system. And if people don't understand what is going on, they become very aggressive, they become very hostile, and I would say very much untrustful when it comes to the authorities and the reform as such. So proper communication and proper explaining of what is going on in the country is the key to building this trust between society and authorities. And the project that I was involved within Ukrainian parliament, first of all, it was having this reforming element. So as practitioners and experts coming from private sector with experience of working both in Ukraine but also abroad on the very big projects, we were to look at the communication system of the parliament as such to see what things can be improved, what is functioning well. In general, have this system building element of our project. That is why, as I mentioned, I was doing international communications in a way, mostly building it from the scratch, because our parliament, unfortunately and very sadly, didn't have the system or the entire methodology of how those ties with foreign parliaments and foreign journalists and different organizations can be produced and can be maintained. What does it mean to have, what does the international communications of the parliament means as such? What are the products that parliament can produce in order to reform main partners? In this case, those are obviously European Parliament of European states, but also the diplomatic corps working in Ukraine. It is incredibly important to inform and keep up to date our partners in international organizations and ambassadors of partner and allied countries of Ukraine to make them understand what Ukraine is doing and how it is changing. The next element, which was also very funny and became a bit of a sensation here in Ukraine, was the social media of Verkhovna Rada. So when I started working with social media of Verkhovna Rada, they had LinkedIn page, they had Twitter page and Facebook page, which were dead, which were absolutely uninteresting, were dull. They posted information only from time to time, and it was so incredibly complex. It was written with such a language that even for me, who is natural Ukrainian speaker from day zero, and someone who knows the literature language and the business Ukrainian very well, sometimes it was so incredibly hard for me to understand what this article or post is about. Very complex and big constructions and sentences, and it was. Even if information is important, you just don't want to read it because of the way it is being written. So I was starting looking, okay, we have this incredible source of information, which is really very much direct. And Ukrainian parliament has its own TV station. They have a newspaper, they have website, which is, by the way, is the most popular parliamentary website in the world.
Okay.
So I don't know for which reasons, but every single year there is, the world comparison of the popularity of parliamentary websites, and the Ukrainian parliament is always number one. This is the phenomena. Maybe it's also because of the fact that the entire legal framework and all the legal system of Ukraine, all the laws, all the regulations, they are on the server of Verkhovna Rada on the portal. So probably people who are just checking the laws, they also immediately go to the webpage of the Verkhovna Rada. Maybe it boosts the traffic as well. But anyway, and there was social media for which there was no concept and there was no idea how to work with it and why do we even need it. Also, with all my due respect, people who were running communications in Verkhovna Rada, they were roughly 50 plus. So even if they are using social media, I wouldn't say, and I don't want to have any kind of age shaming, but they simply didn't understand all the possibilities that social media might give to them as a parliament, yes, not only as an ordinary user. And my experiment started with Twitter when after some time I started being more natural, more relaxed, as a parliament. So I was replying to comments. I was making some jokes in the comment section. Also, one of the first things that I've done is that when you look at the parliament, you understand that in several fields, this is the main newsmaker. So the information about the law being passed or different quarrels or discussions, everything is happening in the parliament. But surprisingly, before we started doing this project, Parliament was never source of information. So, just understand this discrepancy. This is the place where events are happening, but we aren't talking about those events. It's always some journalists or some other media who are actually describing what is going in Parliament. So what I've started doing is I've started working very fast. So, the moment something is happening in the Parliament, always the Verkhovna Rada was the first source of information. This is something that changed. Another thing that changed is that I made the language of the tweets and posts on Facebook suitable to the general mood and the preferences of the platform. So you can't be too serious and you too official when you're writing a tweet. I mean, you can, but then no one will retweet you, no one will be interested in your account. Another step, which was a bit risky, and I remember that even people on my team, they weren't that much comfortable at the very beginning, but it proved to be very much successful. He said, I know it will sound funny, but we started using GIFs on the account of Verkhovna Rada. So mostly you're just using funny picture or funny short video in order to emphasize the information which is being shared. And this is something that became a sensation in Ukraine because it showed that even social media of big institutions, of state institutions, of parliament, they can be very much alive and they can be very much human. This is a place where you can read an important information, but in an interesting way, in a funny way sometimes. And I remember the first time, so obviously there are always jokes about kittens on internet, yeah, and how they're very much popular.
Yeah.
There was a moment when Twitter of Verkhovna Rada was also using some kittens, I must admit, but it was always very much in the framework of still remaining serious. So we were more or less adapting to this general language which is being used on Twitter, on Facebook, but it was always according to the acceptable rules in the society. So, there are certain things that you don't joke about. There are certain images that you aren't using. Even if you're doing something in a funny way, you still can be very much professional and respectful towards other people.
It's interesting. And my last question for you has to deal with going back to the Euromaidan protests. I mean, do you think that had a sort of downstream effect in shaping people using social media for news? I mean, do you think there's a connection in being open to these GIFs in tweets of kittens, for example, by the parliament, and maybe a sort of tradition or a priming effect, I guess, of the protest and people being so reliant on social networks in that context?
Yes. Absolutely. So Maidan has shifted so many different processes. Every single time someone is asking me, whether it was a successful or a failed revolution, I'm saying that it's too much of the different shifts that it's created in the society to say whether it was successful or not. So Maidan is a process and was a process. And one of the things that Maidan has changed, and it was really very much timely, is the consumption preferences and habits of Ukrainians. And this is still an ongoing trend. So, for example, in Ukraine, still almost 80% of Ukrainians have television as their primary source of information. So in that regard, we're very much conservative. But every single year, we have an increasing number of people who use social media and internet as their first source of information. So basically, for some people, Facebook tweet and Twitter feed, and in this regard also Telegram, they become news. The Facebook is a newsmaker. Another very important phenomena that actually Maidan has woken up in Ukraine, and it's also, again, very much about Facebook, it's something which hasn't been seen in other social media in Ukraine, is that during Maidan, the position of central TV stations and biggest media outlets was also very much critical towards the movement. And I would say there were only few TV stations or online newspapers who were sympathetic towards Maidan from the very beginning. Mostly this is because of the ownership of the big media in Ukraine, which are owned by oligarchs, which is a great problem. And oligarchs in that situation, they were partners with Yanukovych. So in a way, they were playing along his game, trying to create the negative picture, negative perception of Maidan. That is why people who wanted to have reliable information, or even, let's say, so alternative information, they were going to social media. Live streams became incredibly popular in Ukraine. Before that, we didn't have this thing about live streaming. And obviously social media. And this, in a way, distrust and dissatisfaction with traditional media, with traditional newspapers and news websites, it created this request for something new. And something new became opinion leaders and popular bloggers. So both Maidan and Facebook, they have created the phenomena of opinion makers in Ukrainian information space. So people who, for example, have absolutely different backgrounds, quite often they aren't journalists, they aren't political scientists, and so on and so forth. They're simply people who are sharing their points of view of what the situation looks like and where country is heading. And if it is proven to be popular among people and people read it, this person gets, hundreds and thousands of followership, and suddenly this is the person who can actually even shape an agenda sometimes. Because I also remember from my own government and parliamentary experience when from time to time we were having this off-the-record meetings with popular bloggers who basically just people who are writing different stuff on Facebook, many people reading them, and suddenly you have to take their opinion into account, because if they will be criticizing you, it means that also their followers will be criticizing you. So this is the phenomena which is really very, very much about Ukraine and about Facebook, and the fact that suddenly you have bloggers who can even sometimes shape the national agenda and the national public debate.
It's so interesting. It's a case of so many academic theories put in practice, from connective action and protests to disinformation and platform manipulation to how these sort of interact over time. So, Kateryna, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out and coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
I've just been speaking with Kateryna Kruk, analyst at Stop Fake and a special fellow at the European Values think tank. And that'll do it for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, we'll have Professor Rachel Gibson from the University of Manchester to discuss digital tech adoption by British parties over time and the role of social media in British political communication. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.